Now, our feature for today's episode is to look at the notion of Indigenous data sovereignty. Now, I've been wanting to do a newsletter issue on Indigenous data sovereignty for some time, but, it always gets eclipsed by more exciting news, like Facebook beating up on Australia, or, a young activist like Disha Ravi being arrested in India. So unfortunately, I keep deferring having a conversation or taking the time to really shed light on the emerging concept of Indigenous data sovereignty. But I kind of felt that was irresponsible, that Indigenous data sovereignty is so important that it's something that we, really need to not just put attention on, but celebrate and use as an example outside of Indigenous communities, that I kind of felt I could defer it no longer. That Indigenous data sovereignty is so important, so crucial, and so timely that it merits being today's feature of today's episode. And I want to take a moment to both explore Indigenous data sovereignty as a concept, elaborate on how I think it can apply outside of Indigenous communities, but also why it provides an opportunity for us to collaborate, for us to support, for us to really not just embody our notion of decentralized technology, but also that technology can and should be empowering to communities, and in this case, Indigenous communities. So if you Google Indigenous data sovereignty, you'll find that there's actually a growing set of resources that help researchers like ourselves, cyberpunks like us, to learn more about what activists are doing in this area, what Indigenous communities are doing in this area, and the way in which Indigenous data sovereignty is starting to emerge as a very powerful and reliable concept. So this comes from the Global Investigative Journalism Network, and I kind of felt that this was a good sort of primer or starting point for the concept, right? And it sort of evokes the notion that data is a new world, a world of opportunity, and that the lack of reliable and consistent data results in a paucity of evidence-based Indigenous policymaking. Which is to say, part of the role of Indigenous data sovereignty is empowering Indigenous communities to resist, defy, or even collaborate with other nation governments, with other settler or colonial governments, to defend and preserve their cultures, to defend and preserve their methods of governance, so that they can, assert their sovereignty, that they can protect and preserve their cultures. Which, for those of us who take for granted how easy technology can be used, we forget that there's a certain culture behind that technology that is often not reflected in Indigenous cultures. And that we need to translate our technology to reflect and respect the culture of First Nations so that they can use the technology as they see fit, rather than use the technology that we might believe the technology should be used. And that's an important point that here at MetaViews we keep coming back to, which is that all technology is subjective. And everyone will use technology in a new and exciting way. And so we should afford Indigenous communities the right and the ability to use data, to use technology as they want, and not in the way that we want. And I think that is really essential. So in terms of the background of Indigenous data sovereignty, it's things like the right to govern the collection of data. The right to decide who gets to be counted, who gets to not be counted, so that the data reflects the interests and priorities of Indigenous peoples. This includes the right to determine who has access to that data and how it can be used. And this goes back to, one of the crimes that colonial powers have committed against Indigenous peoples, which is to send in researchers to study them, but not engage those Indigenous peoples in the research themselves, and then not share the data, and then use the data against them in terms of genocidal policies. So there's a natural distrust in many Indigenous communities against researchers and against people harvesting their data and taking it away from them. So this is the idea that if anyone's going to collect data about Indigenous peoples, it's going to be those communities themselves. and they will retain the right. They will retain the control of that data so that it can't be used against them. Now, in this context, they talk about problems that arise from that, such as limited control over data collection decisions, and widespread data gaps mean that some communities lack the information to analyze and solve problems. Because this is where the digital divide can be a real problem in terms of inter-Indigenous nation relations. Right? If you imagine, let's say, two different Northern Cree communities, where one of those communities has internet access and one doesn't. So one community is able to build literacy, learn how to use technology, gather data about how technology and policies in the community should be used, whereas another community does not have those same privileges, does not have those same abilities. So this is why there's a need to recognize not just within a single community the need to develop that literacy, but throughout an entire region, throughout Indigenous communities around the world, right? And that's where the digital divide is not just about connectivity, it is about literacy. It is about proficiency and capability in general. So they talk about some of the opportunities around thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty. What is the adequacy of official statistics? What barriers exist to getting more data? Do Indigenous communities lack control over existing data? What are the practical effects of data gaps? How do governments, agencies use existing data? Is it problematic, that data? Should they defer doing more work until new data is collected? Could disaggregated data have unwanted side effects, such as exacerbating discrimination or violating personal privacy? And could the lack of disaggregated data negatively impact smaller communities whose special problems no longer surface? These are interesting research questions that get into some of the challenges moving forward in terms of Indigenous data sovereignty. Now, I jumped to the wrong window. Now, here in Canada, prematurely played that video, there's the First Nations Information Governance Center. So this is an organization that was set up across Indigenous communities across Canada as a way to foster this kind of capability in individual communities themselves. And they talk about our data, our stories, our future. And they envision that every First Nation will achieve data sovereignty in alignment with that nation's distinct worldview. And they talk about how their national surveys are by First Nations for First Nations. And it illustrates, even on the level of social science, how crucial it is to foster that kind of Indigenous data sovereignty. And as I accidentally triggered, they do have a kind of short 2-minute video that I'd like to play that sort of illustrates the sort of work that they do. So let me just make sure that I have the audio unmuted. And let me know in the chat if there's issues with the sound here.
First Nations people have always understood the value of community, the importance of respect, and the need to protect our resources for future generations. And today, one of our most important resources is information. First Nations people have always been information gatherers. When we track and hunt or gather food from the land, we're engaging in information gathering that has a direct and important impact on our lives. First Nations people understand that information isn't just about numbers and surveys. It's about culture, identity, traditions, and self-determination. That's why the First Nation Information Governance Center was created. Since 1996, its mission has been to uphold the values of OCAP, a set of principles designed to protect First Nations ownership and jurisdiction over their information, and ensure that First Nations people are the stewards of their own information. OCAP ensures that First Nations people have ownership both individually and collectively as a community. It puts them in control so that they can decide how it is used, by whom, and under what conditions. It ensures that they have the right to determine and define access regardless of where it is held. And it defines possession, ensuring that they have the power to use their information for the benefit of their own communities. Possession is key to making ownership, access, and control possible. Taking together, the First Nations principles of OCAP embody one important idea: that First Nations people understand their own needs and are in the best position to govern their own information. The right of First Nations communities to own, control, access, and possess information about their peoples is fundamentally tied to self-determination and to the preservation and development of their culture.
Now, I thought that was a fantastic video that, I think illustrates the holistic reasons as to why Indigenous communities should own and control their data. But I want to tease another reason as to why it's essential for Indigenous communities to be in control of their data and have their data. And that's the environment, and that's climate change. I mean, on the one hand, we're talking about the need for Indigenous communities to maintain sovereignty, to have governance models that reflect their values and their cultures. And we're also thinking about the way in which Indigenous communities have their own issues with regard to, say, settler governments or colonial governments, like water quality, and this is where I'm getting at, environmental damage, that we also tend to associate Indigenous culture with environmental stewardship or climate stewardship. And certainly here in Canada, whether it comes to fighting pipelines or when it comes to defending the quality of water and water sources, Indigenous communities have been at the forefront of those battles. And there's an opportunity to collect environmental data, climate data, to demonstrate the way in which climate change is not only happening, but it's going to impact and have a disparate impact on Indigenous communities, in many cases first, and in many cases in such devastating ways, such as flooding, such as other extreme elements. And so part of this is not just Indigenous data sovereignty for cultural purposes, for research purposes, but it's for political purposes, to demand action on climate change and to document what's happening to our environment, and to ensure that they have control of that data, the same way that they can not only verify the integrity of that data, but then ensure that the data that they collect about their environment, about their climate, is used for their purposes, which would be managing and stewarding and taking care of it. And I think that's an important issue to think about moving forward. But, before we close off this segment on Indigenous data, I also want to give one final example here from Canada, which is the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative. So the first example I gave was sort of pan-Canadian, versus in this example, it's British Columbia. And the British Columbia Nations Data Governance Initiative is interesting because, here in Canada, the First Nations in British Columbia are a little different than First Nations in the rest of the country. And the primary reason is geography, right? The primary reason is the Rocky Mountains. That as the Europeans came across the Atlantic and started engaging in genocide and conquest, they couldn't really get past the Rocky Mountains. Or by the time they did, colonialism was losing wind and, Britain as an imperial power was starting to fade. So while First Nation communities based in British Columbia still have experienced hardship at the hands of colonial governments, they are far more likely to have retained their culture, retained their sovereignty, retained some level of status as an Indigenous nation. And so they are the ones who are at the forefront of normalizing relations with provincial governments and with federal governments. And as a result, they are, to a certain extent, providing a lot of leadership when it comes to data governance initiatives for First Nations and embodying this notion of data sovereignty. So I offer this as an example because I do a lot of these segments on the show, not just the benefit of my fellow cyberpunks who are watching this live, But because we put many of these segments up on YouTube, and I kind of leave these as digital breadcrumbs for activists, for researchers, for students, for people who are curious about the internet and they're Googling on YouTube, they're walking along the web, and they're looking for resources to educate themselves. And so I like to offer a narrative path that in this case not only justifies the value of Indigenous data sovereignty, but points to some of the leaders in the field who hopefully a year from now, 2 years from now, are not only going to still be there, but will have made tremendous progress in developing this idea or concept even further. And that's where I think the British Columbia First Nations Data Governance Initiative is something that we will return to, we will circle back to. But if you're watching this video at some point in the future and you've gotten to this point, go check them out, because I think that they are very much worth your attention and support. And it'll be interesting to see the work that they've done since we recorded this conversation. Now, our pal Nuviak pointed out that it's near impossible to separate Indigenous data from non-Indigenous data due to the due to the sort of nature of the internet. So hopefully the solutions that will apply to one will apply to all. And I think that's one of the reasons why Indigenous solidarity is so essential, that we recognize as those of us with European descent who happen to find ourselves here on Turtle Island, that we would make an effort to align ourselves with First Nations, because the gains that they make are gains that we can make as well. And that's where, I highlighted that chat, Nuviak, momentarily, because it would be negligent of me to talk about Indigenous data sovereignty without actually talking about Indigenous connectivity, right? The way in which Native communities, rural and remote communities, they need broadband internet. They need high-speed internet. This is an article put out by our friends at the Internet Society, Connecting Indigenous Communities, an urgent call for inclusivity, ownership, and affordability. This talks about how in 2020, the Internet Society hosted the Indigenous Connectivity Summit. And part of what they championed was not just affordable internet access in Indigenous communities, but just as we're talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, well, we're also talking about Indigenous connectivity sovereignty. That Indigenous communities should own and control their own internet. They shouldn't depend upon some external entity providing them internet. They should have their own internet, control that internet, so that they can shape who uses it and how. That's internet sovereignty, not just data sovereignty. And here at MetaViews, as part of our Future Fiber series, it's been something that we've been writing about quite a bit. We wrote an issue on MuralNet, which is an Oakland, California nonprofit that helps Indigenous communities in the United States build their own high-speed internet networks. I encourage all of you cyberpunks currently watching and listening to follow MuralNet on Twitter to connect with the work that they're doing. We regularly see their tweets. They do a lot of really interesting stuff. And MuralNet in general is just a fascinating and powerful organization we support. Of course, we are also proud supporters of Nuviak, who I am very happy are active members here in MetaViews. And in fact, our good pal Mike West, who is one of the operators of Nuviak, is an associate producer here of the Cyberpunk Now show. And Mike has lined up a guest for us on Thursday's Cyberpunk Now show, where we are going to be entertaining the pitfalls of transparency. And maybe transparency as a concept is not as automatically good as we thought it was, but instead could actually be empowering the wealthy and empowering the powerful. So a big shout out there to Nuviak for helping to line that up. And big shout out to Doofus Tumish for, I assume this is your first show, so I'm glad that our content has resonated. Nuviak does point out that connectivity has been hijacked by the federal government, who prop up terrible companies like Northwest Tel and Telesat. We also did a MetaViews issue way back in the day on Nuviak's efforts up in the Arctic, and we'll come back to that. Now, we'll take a moment here due to BK's request to take a dad joke as part of our intermission here in the show. After wife's delivery, husband asks nurse, "How soon do you think we'll be able to have sex?" Nurse says, "Meet me after 20 minutes and don't talk so loudly." Ba-doom. And so not only is BK going to be our associate producer for news from South Asia and the subcontinent, but he will also be a regular provider of dad jokes in poor taste. Another feature here of the Cyberpunk Now show. Oh, Doofus Tumish is behind the First Nation Internet Exchange. Fantastic. That's great to know. Hey, maybe Doofus Tumish will have you on as a guest to talk about the First Nations Internet Exchange at some future episode. A big prop, again, to Nuviak, one of our associate producers here of the Cyberpunk Now show. But with that said, I am really pleased that Doofus Tumish, you're here for today's episode. And Nuviak, our next segment, was another reason why I pinged you via Signal this morning to make sure that you were watching the show. After our feature segment of every episode here on Cyberpunk Now, I like to take a moment to look at a little bit of research or a policy idea or even a government program. And the idea is that at Cyberpunk Now, it's not enough to just be a dissident, right? It's not enough to just be the government sucks. It's also important for us to imagine what we would do when we take over the government, right? It's important for us as citizens in a theoretical democracy to debate and imagine the policies that we demand. And similarly, as researchers in a cyberpunk society, we're always curious about what research we should be championing, about what research we should be amplifying, and what are the programs that we think really work well. Now, with that said, today I actually want to showcase a current initiative by the federal government, in particular by Transport Canada, called Enhanced Maritime Situational Awareness. Now, one of the reasons that I moved from Toronto to the Ottawa Valley was I wanted to infiltrate government. I wanted to get a little closer to the federal government, but not too close, so that I might learn a little more as to the types of activities that the feds were up to. Partly because I am the type of mature individual who recognizes that governments are not monolith, and that while governments are not always democratic, they do have factions within them that are pro-democrats, that are engaged in finding new ways of governing and new ways of engaging citizens and communities in how they govern themselves. So I take a very nuanced approach, which is to say we need to champion and promote the government programs that work. We need to champion and promote the people working inside of government who are doing good things and deserve community and public support. And I feel I have an example of that today. So I would like to share with you, my friends, my fellow cyberpunks, the story of the Enhanced Maritime Situational Awareness Initiative, which is a program engaged, coordinated, initiated, facilitated by our friends at Transport Canada. And the idea of Enhanced Maritime Situational Awareness is to partner with coastal communities and engage them in the overall process of marine safety, environmental protection, marine activity, local knowledge, and space-based data. Now, before we get into the details of how this program works, allow me to sort of describe the potential, right? Imagine, if you will, that we currently live in a cyberpunk society in which surveillance has been democratized. in which anybody or any community can engage in surveillance, especially if you're surveilling your neighborhood, especially if you're surveilling your own backyard. And often there can be benefits to that surveillance, especially if, for example, you're a coastal First Nations community and you want to monitor your waterways. You want to monitor your community to make sure that industry doesn't come and pollute, to make sure that other people don't come into your community and use your resources or pollute your resources or engage in activities that you as a community don't want. So to go back to our concept of Indigenous data sovereignty, you can almost imagine how a coastal First Nations could use surveillance as part of an Indigenous data sovereignty strategy in which they're engaging in a kind of community awareness or enhanced maritime situational awareness that actually helps reinforce and strengthen that community to both protect their sovereignty, but also engage with the outside world, maybe not as equals, but at least with greater strategic advantage. And that is, in essence, the goal, or at least the aspiration, of the Enhanced Maritime Situational Awareness Program. Now, this program is not available to the public. That's one of the requirements of Indigenous data sovereignty, right? If you're going to go to First Nation communities, if you're going to go to coastal Indigenous communities and say, hey, we want you to partner in this collaborative surveillance initiative, and they say, all right, but we want to exercise Indigenous data sovereignty, well, that by definition means it can't be open to the public. That you can't allow anybody to go and look at that data because those First Nations communities, they get to decide who has access to that data. Now, I, as a public speaker, last year, I spoke at a Government of Canada event around AI and ethics, and I said a lot of stuff that was, radical and crazy, as I used to do, because as an entertainer, that's my shtick. And the folks at the EMSA, folks at Transport Canada, they liked what I said. So they invited me to join them and have a demo in which they shared with me how the EMSA worked. And I told them, I said, look, if you invite me in for a demo, I'm going to want to tell people. I'm going to want to tell my friends. I'm going to want to write a story about this on MetaViews. And they said it was okay. They gave me permission. So they sent me some screenshots, and these screenshots have been pre-approved. So this is not a live access, and these images have sort of been, cleared in terms of protection. But I feel that they give a good glimpse as to how the EMSA system works. So here's an example right here of Victoria and kind of the lower tip of Vancouver Island. And on the right here, you can see, and I'll zoom in a little, you can see the different types of things that you can put on the network and track. And so this is all real time. And it's showing all the vessels, what kind of vessel they are, who that vessel is registered to. And in the actual interface, if you click on any of these vessels, it gives you a remarkable amount of information about that boat. So what I find interesting about this image is, imagine the activism around pipelines and imagine the concern around tankers coming in. I mean, this is meant to measure who those tankers are, whether there'd be an incident, whether there'd be a spill. Here's another example, right? These are meant to be heat maps. So this is showing you maritime activity and where that activity is most frequent and how that activity is structured, right? So, there's all different types of data overlays or data layers that exist. The first example I gave was vessels, was ships in terms of the AIS network, but that's just one layer of many. This was the usage or the heat map layer. And then the other is you can get into jurisdiction or zoning errors, and it also includes historical data. So it'll show you where vessels have traveled over time and the extent to which those vessels are authorized or not authorized to be in those areas. And, again, I'm giving this sort of information in a limited capacity because it was a long time ago that I received this demo. So unfortunately, a lot of that has kind of teetered back. But this system is always evolving, in that in showing you screenshots, I'm not articulating the true value that this system is able to provide. Because presently, the real value of this system is conceptual. It's collaborative, right? It's a platform that allows the federal government to interface with the governments of First Nations, with Indigenous governments, over the joint management of maritime waterways, right? So, the way that my friends at the AMSA were articulating is, this is a tangible example of reconciliation. Because not only are they collaborating with First Nation governments, finding a joint governance model by which maritime environments could be collaboratively governed between the federal government and between coastal First Nations, but they're also fostering an Indigenous data sovereignty in which these First Nations are collecting environmental data, collecting maritime data, industrial data about who is using their waterways, including their own peoples. I mean, what they didn't show, what I can't show, are Indigenous fisheries, right? Think about the conflict that happened here in Canada a few months ago in Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick, between Indigenous fisheries and non-Indigenous fisheries that became violent. This allows First Nations to collect data about all the fisheries and all the activity that's happening in maritime environments. So it gives them the power to say, look, we are running responsible fisheries. Those companies, those factories, those industrial outfits are not, and here's the proof. So it can be incredibly empowering, not just on a level of normalizing relationships between governments, between the Indigenous governments and the Canadian government, but also facilitating greater control by these coastal First Nations over their coastal water.